The night before our wedding anniversary, I learned why my husband never wanted kids. I remember the night starting quietly, almost too quietly. The house felt still in a way that made every small sound stand out, from the ticking of the hallway clock to the soft hum of the fridge settling after a long day. I moved through the living room with that familiar blend of comfort and unease, the kind that appears when your mind has been whispering something you aren't ready to face. My husband had gone to bed earlier than usual, claiming he was exhausted from work. He didn't kiss my forehead the way he normally did, and I noticed the way he avoided holding my gaze when he told me goodnight. It wasn't dramatic, nothing anyone else would have recognized, but it landed in my chest like a quiet weight I couldn't name. I stayed downstairs longer than I meant to, pretending to scroll through my phone while my thoughts drifted. The glow from the lamp cast a warm circle across the coffee table, and I kept tracing the edge of it with my eyes as if the light could steady my nerves. Our wedding anniversary was hours away, and I wanted to feel excited, but something inside me felt suspended, unsure. I tried earlier in the evening to talk about the plans I hoped we'd make for the weekend, wondering if a small getaway might help us reconnect. He brushed it off with a flat smile, saying he was too overwhelmed for anything big this year. It wasn't unkind, but it wasn't warm either, and the way he rubbed the back of his neck made it clear he didn't want to linger on the topic. For months, maybe longer, I'd sensed a distance growing between us, a subtle shift I couldn't quite point to. He laughed less. He held me less. He seemed distracted even in moments that used to be natural for us, like sitting together after dinner or folding laundry on Sunday evenings. I kept telling myself it was stress, that seasons of marriage had ups and downs, but the excuses were starting to feel thin. That night, while I sat curled on the sofa with a blanket over my legs, I thought about the conversations we never finished, especially the ones about children. I had always imagined we would build a family, maybe not right away, but one day. Every time I tried to bring it up, he found a reason to delay the discussion. Different reasons, always shifting, always reasonable on the surface but hollow underneath. The air in the room felt heavy, as if holding things I couldn't see. Outside, a slow wind pressed lightly against the windows, and the branches scraped just enough to make the house feel older than it was. I tried to breathe through the tightness forming at the center of my chest, telling myself I was being overly sensitive, but my body wasn't convinced. I stood up and walked into the kitchen, needing movement, needing something to break the strange stillness that had wrapped itself around me. The tile floor felt cold under my feet, and I placed my palms on the counter to steady myself. Even the familiar scent of dish soap seemed sharper than normal, as if the room itself was paying attention. When I finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I paused halfway up the steps. There was no reason for it, just an instinct, a small pull in my gut that made me still my breath. The hallway light cast a soft glow toward our bedroom door, and for a moment, the quiet felt louder than any noise I could imagine. I told myself I was tired, that I was making stories out of shadows and silence. But as I stepped into the bedroom and heard my husband shift slightly in his sleep, a faint tremor passed through me. Not fear exactly, just a sharp awareness, the sense that something in the air had changed, even if I didn't yet understand why. I slipped under the covers beside him, feeling the cool sheets beneath my legs and the warmth coming from his side of the bed. He didn't move toward me the way he sometimes did, even unconsciously. He stayed still, his breathing deep and even, as if he were far away in a place I couldn't reach. I closed my eyes, hoping rest would come, but all I felt was the quiet press of unspoken questions settling around me like the darkness itself. I lay there listening to the rhythm of his breathing and the faint creak of the ceiling fan drifting above us. The room felt colder than usual, as if something had shifted out of place. I didn't know what it meant, but it settled into me with a lingering heaviness quietly. I used to believe our marriage had grown from something steady and uncomplicated, the kind of love that didn't make loud promises but settled gently into daily life. From the start, he made me feel chosen, as if he saw something in me he'd been searching for. I carried that belief quietly, letting it guide my understanding of us. Even now, I can still picture the warmth in his eyes during those early days, a warmth that made everything feel certain. We built our routines without much effort, falling into comfortable patterns that felt almost like a shared language. I would make coffee in the mornings, and he would turn on the news, letting the soft sounds fill the kitchen. Sometimes he'd reach out and squeeze my hand without saying anything. Those small gestures were the foundation I trusted, the moments that made me believe our connection was real. It never occurred to me then that foundations can shift invisibly. Back then, we talked about our future the way people do when they're hopeful, sketching vague timelines for travel, career goals, and renovations we wanted to make someday. Whenever the idea of children surfaced, he responded gently, always with a soft smile and a promise that we had time. His tone was reassuring enough that I tucked my questions away. I didn't realize how carefully he nudged every conversation away from specifics, how smoothly he redirected each possibility. Looking back, I can see the small pauses in his expressions, the subtle tension in his shoulders when the topic lingered too long. But at the time, his hesitation felt like patience, not fear. I told myself he simply needed more time to adjust to the idea of becoming a father. I didn't recognize that he wasn't adjusting at all, he was avoiding. Still, because we rarely fought, I convinced myself everything between us was steady. During our second year of marriage, friends started asking when we planned to start a family. Their questions were light, casual, the kind people toss out without thinking. I always laughed and gave vague answers, glancing at him for reassurance. He smiled along easily, but his grip on my waist would subtly tighten, as if anchoring himself. I interpreted it as affection, not discomfort. I didn't realize he was bracing for a truth he wasn't ready to confront. As the years passed, our home began to fill with hints of the life I imagined for us. Blankets he bought me for cozy evenings, framed photos from trips, furniture we picked together. Everything looked like a space meant to grow a family. He encouraged those choices, complimenting my taste and joking about how comfortable the house had become. I mistook his enthusiasm for shared dreams. I never questioned why his eyes flickered whenever children appeared in the background of our conversations. He was attentive in ways that felt effortless. When I was sick, he made soup. When I had long workdays, he warmed dinner. When I cried over a stressful moment, he wrapped me in his arms until I steadied. Those moments made him feel like a partner who could weather anything with me. I held onto them tightly, even as small inconsistencies began to appear in the spaces between them. The softness he showed never quite matched the quiet distance he carried. There were times when he disappeared inside himself, becoming quiet in a way that felt unreachable. I assumed everyone had days like that, moments where the world asked too much. He always returned to me eventually, claiming he just needed rest or time to decompress. I accepted those explanations because they were simple, because I loved him, because it felt easier to trust than to question. I didn't see those quiet retreats as part of something much larger. Every now and then, I would feel a pang of longing for the future I envisioned. Children running through the hallway, family dinners, holidays surrounded by noise and warmth. When I tried to express those hopes, he would listen attentively, nodding at all the right moments. But something in his eyes would dim, almost imperceptibly. He never argued. He never dismissed me. He simply redirected the moment with softness, leaving my dreams unanswered but intact. By the time I realized how much I had adapted myself around his silences, years had already passed. I began to notice that our conversations about the future had become narrower, more careful, shaped around what he didn't say rather than what he did. I felt the shift long before I acknowledged it. Something in me sensed that a truth lived beneath his gentleness, something I wasn't meant to see. Still, I told myself love was enough. Even when a quiet uncertainty settled inside me like a shadow, I used to replay certain early moments in my mind, moments that now feel heavy with meaning I didn't recognize at the time. One of the first hints came during our first spring together, when friends brought their newborn to a barbecue. I remember holding the baby, feeling a gentle warmth settle into my chest. When I looked up, my husband's smile didn't match mine. It looked tight, stretched, as if he were holding something back. Later that afternoon, he suggested we leave early because he had a headache, though he'd seemed fine minutes before. In the car, he kept his hands locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. I assumed he was tired, maybe overwhelmed by the noise. I didn't question it, but the silence he carried home with him felt deeper than simple exhaustion, like he'd opened a door in himself he was struggling to close again. Another moment surfaced a few months later, when a coworker of mine announced she was pregnant. I shared the news with him over dinner, expecting a light-hearted conversation about our own someday. Instead, he went quiet, pushing his food around his plate while avoiding my eyes. He eventually said he was happy for her, but the strain in his voice didn't match his words. I felt a flicker of confusion but smothered it quickly, afraid to push too hard. Little signs kept drifting in, small enough to ignore but noticeable enough to linger in the back of my mind. During family gatherings, he always found reasons to step outside when kids became playful or loud, choosing to busy himself with tasks that didn't need doing. He'd offer to take out the trash, check the grill, reorganize the cooler, anything that kept him at the edges. I interpreted it as introversion, unaware of the deeper truth shadowing his behavior. I also remember the day we visited my sister's house, where her 2 boys were running wild through the living room. She handed one of them to him playfully, insisting he get some practice. His entire body stiffened when the toddler reached for him. He forced a laugh, but I saw a flash of something sharp in his expression. Fear, maybe, or a memory he didn't want revived. I brushed it off as discomfort, never imagining it was a warning. Even small conversations held pieces I failed to assemble at the time. When my friend joked about us having beautiful babies someday, he laughed along, but it was a hollow sound, lacking the warmth he usually carried. Later that night, he held me tighter than usual, almost as if he were trying to reassure both of us. I sensed a peculiar heaviness in him, but I convinced myself it was stress from work, not something rooted much deeper. There was one evening when I brought up the idea of starting a family more directly, feeling hopeful and ready for an honest conversation. He listened quietly, nodding in all the right places, yet his hands trembled slightly as he folded and refolded the corner of a napkin. He told me we had plenty of time, that we should enjoy our freedom a little longer. I believed him, not noticing how his eyes darkened at the mention of children. At the time, I didn't see these moments as connected threads. I thought they were isolated quirks, temporary discomforts that would fade as we grew older and more settled. Love made me patient, and trust made me blind to the tension in his shoulders whenever parenthood appeared in the background of our lives. He carried that tension quietly, burying it under chores, distractions, and carefully chosen words that kept deeper conversations comfortably out of reach. I sometimes wonder when exactly my instincts began whispering that something wasn't right. Maybe it was during a quiet night on the couch when he flinched slightly at a commercial featuring a laughing family. Or perhaps it was when he changed the subject abruptly after my cousin announced her pregnancy. Each moment left a faint impression, like fingerprints on glass, but I wiped them away before they had time to settle. I wasn't ready to question him or myself. So many signs were there from the beginning, subtle enough to blend into our life but persistent enough to tug at me in quiet moments. I trusted him fully, believing that his hesitations came from uncertainty rather than fear. Now, looking back, I understand how carefully he skirted around the topic, how intentionally he stayed just outside the emotional spaces where the truth might slip out. I didn't know it then, but his silence was the first crack in our foundation. Those quiet omissions were warnings I didn't yet know how to hear. They settled inside me over time. It was during our 3rd year of marriage that his avoidance stopped feeling occasional and began settling into something steady. Every time I mentioned children, even lightly, he shifted in his seat as if adjusting to discomfort he didn't want me to notice. His responses grew shorter, vague reassurances wrapped in soft tones that didn't match the tension in his jaw. I tried to ignore the way his eyes drifted toward the floor. I told myself couples worked through timing differently. Patterns formed quietly, almost invisibly at first. When I brought up the idea of scheduling a doctor's appointment to discuss future planning, he responded with a new excuse about stress at work. The next month, he mentioned finances. Later, it was travel plans he insisted we should focus on instead. None of his reasons aligned, yet I didn't question them. I wanted to trust him more than I wanted to examine the discomfort spreading through me. Even everyday routines shifted in small but noticeable ways. He stayed later at work, calling just as I was setting dinner on the table, claiming meetings ran long or deadlines stacked up. When he came home, he seemed drained, offering affection that felt practiced rather than natural. I convinced myself adult life was simply wearing us down. Still, I couldn't ignore the strange distance in his eyes when I asked how he'd been spending his time. I also noticed the way he withdrew during moments that should have brought us closer. Family gatherings, baby showers, even simple afternoons at parks made him tense. He busied himself with tasks that didn't require doing, lingering at the edges of conversations. When relatives teased us about kids, he laughed, but his hand on my shoulder tightened. I felt the pressure of that silent message. Later, he dismissed it as harmless humor. I pretended to believe him because it was easier. The excuses became predictable long before I allowed myself to admit it. If I suggested making long-term plans, he redirected the topic to weekend chores or errands. If I hinted at wanting a future that included a family, he offered vague praise for living in the moment. His tone never shifted into frustration, which almost made it harder. He didn't argue, he sidestepped, and I followed his steps, slowly losing track of my own desires while trying to protect our sense of peace. There were nights when he seemed lost in thought, staring at the television without absorbing a single thing. His fork paused halfway to his mouth at dinner, and he blinked as if waking from somewhere far away. When I asked if he was okay, he smiled too quickly, too widely, giving answers that didn't match the heaviness in his body. I sensed a wall building between us, made not of anger, but of secrets I couldn't name. The emotional distance wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet and persistent, settling into the spaces where intimacy used to be. We stopped having long conversations before bed. He stopped reaching for my hand when we walked through grocery store aisles. Instead, he kept small but steady physical distance, enough for me to feel the absence without understanding it. I didn't realize how lonely a marriage could feel when silence replaced connection. At first, I believed the issue was me. I blamed my hopes, my timing, my desire for more. I wondered if I'd pushed too hard, even though all I'd ever done was share dreams. I read articles about communication and told myself relationships had seasons. I tried to create moments for us. Date nights, small surprises, handwritten notes tucked into his jacket. He appreciated them politely, but something in his expressions felt muted, as if he were responding from a safe distance. There were evenings when I caught him staring at his reflection in the hallway mirror. His shoulders slumped in a way that didn't look like fatigue. It looked like resignation. When he noticed me watching, he straightened immediately, clearing his throat and saying he was just tired. I nodded even though confusion pricked at me. His avoidance had shifted from subtle to habitual, and yet I stayed quiet, hoping love alone might nudge him back into openness. By the end of that year, avoidance had become our unspoken routine. Every conversation that brushed against the future seemed to trigger a gentle but unmistakable retreat. I felt myself tiptoeing around my own dreams, reshaping my expectations to match the contours of his silence. I didn't understand why he was pulling away, but I felt the distance grow as steadily as the nightly quiet between us. Even then, I still believed honesty would eventually find its way through. I didn't realize he was building a life around what he refused to share. It was around that time I began paying closer attention to the things he never said, rather than the ones he did. His silences carried weight, subtle but undeniable, especially any time our future came into view. I noticed how he physically shifted when the word family appeared in conversation, as if bracing for impact. Even casual comments from friends about growing older together made his shoulders stiffen. These reactions collected quietly in my mind, forming a pattern I could no longer explain away. I remember one weekend when we visited a friend who'd recently had a baby. The moment we stepped inside, the soft cries coming from the nursery made him pause. His expression tightened before he forced a polite smile and moved toward the living room. Throughout the visit, he kept finding excuses to step outside, pretending to check his phone, offering to run out for snacks, anything to escape the sound of the baby's cooing. I felt unease settle into me like a slow fog. Later, when we drove home, I tried gently mentioning how sweet the baby was. He nodded without looking at me, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. He responded with something vague about not being ready, but his tone didn't match the simplicity of his words. It sounded layered, complicated, almost pained. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, though I smiled and let the conversation drift in another direction. Even then, I sensed a deeper truth beneath his discomfort. There were moments when he seemed almost startled by tenderness, moments that should have felt natural. Once, while watching a movie, a character surprised his wife with news of a pregnancy. My husband's body tensed immediately, his breath catching just slightly. He reached for the remote and pretended to be bored, changing the channel before I could register his reaction fully. Small details like that lingered with me long after the moment passed, settling into my thoughts when I lay awake at night. I began noticing how carefully he managed our lives, almost as if trying to build a world where certain possibilities never surfaced. He encouraged travel, spontaneous trips, new hobbies, anything that framed our marriage as an ongoing adventure instead of a foundation for something bigger. Whenever I hinted at wanting stability or long-term planning, he suggested keeping things flexible. At the time, it felt like freedom, but later I understood it was a way to avoid confronting what he feared most. One evening, while cleaning out a drawer, I came across an unopened parenting book someone had gifted us during our engagement. Dust had settled on the cover, and something about that untouched spine made my chest tighten. I set it on the counter, curious to see if he'd react. When he noticed it later, he froze for a second before casually sweeping it into a stack of mail. His expression didn't change, but his hands trembled slightly. I pretended not to see, though the image stayed with me. He also became increasingly protective of his personal space. His office, once a room we shared occasionally, slowly became off-limits. He claimed it was too cluttered, too messy, and that he didn't want me to trip over cables or paperwork. But sometimes, when he forgot to close the door completely, I'd glimpse him sitting there alone, staring at something on his desk with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't sadness exactly, more like haunted contemplation. During a quiet Sunday morning, I asked him directly whether something was wrong. The words slipped out before I could stop them, soft but sincere. He smiled, reassuring me that everything was fine, brushing my cheek with a tenderness that only deepened my confusion. His voice was steady, but his eyes weren't. They carried an exhaustion I hadn't noticed before, as if he were holding together a fragile structure built from secrets he didn't know how to confess. Despite the growing tension, he continued treating me with kindness, almost overly so. He surprised me with flowers more often, cooked dinner on nights he usually wouldn't, and checked in on me throughout the day with quick messages. It should have felt comforting, but instead it felt like he was trying to balance something he couldn't let slip. The sweetness seemed like an attempt to keep me from looking too closely at the gaps forming between us. By that point, the warning signs were no longer isolated moments. They formed a quiet melody beneath our daily life. I felt them in the pauses between conversations, the shift in his posture when certain topics appeared, the way he avoided looking at pregnant women in public. I couldn't name the fear growing inside me, but it took root all the same. I told myself marriages had difficult chapters, but deep down, I knew something in ours was quietly unraveling. Even if I didn't yet know why, the distance between us had already begun to widen. That I first noticed the change in his behavior with his phone on an ordinary Tuesday evening. We had just finished dinner, and he placed his phone face down on the table, unusually protective of it, as if it contained something I wasn't meant to see. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle shift, but I caught it immediately. The way his hand hovered over it, almost shielding it from my glance, planted the tiniest seed of unease in me. Over the next few days, the pattern became more pronounced. He would answer texts in another room, his back turned, or pretend to scroll casually when I entered the living room. Sometimes he would place the phone in his pocket, checking it almost compulsively. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe he had work messages, or maybe I was reading too much into ordinary habits. But the protective tension in his shoulders suggested something else entirely. I started noticing small details I had never registered before. The passcode changed several times, always after a vague excuse about security. Notifications would appear and vanish before I had the chance to look, and sometimes his thumb hovered over the screen for longer than necessary before responding. Even the way he carried it, close to his chest on the couch, tucked under his arm while walking, felt like he was guarding a secret that could unravel everything if exposed. One night, I tried to brush it off. We were lying in bed, the hum of the ceiling fan above us, the sheets warm beneath our legs. His phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand. He reached for it instantly, his hand covering the screen in a way that felt deliberate. He didn't look at me, didn't even pause. I felt a prickle in my chest, the same uneasy sensation I'd felt months before. That subtle awareness that something was quietly shifting under the surface of our lives. I began observing patterns I had previously ignored. He would leave the room for short periods, phone in hand, claiming calls from work or friends. Sometimes he'd step outside, muttering about checking emails, and return moments later as if nothing had happened. But I noticed the way his expression tightened, how he exhaled sharply when he thought I wasn't paying attention. These were small, almost invisible moments, but they carried weight. Something was hidden, and he was careful to protect it. The secrecy gnawed at me. I felt a mixture of guilt and curiosity, a strange tension that kept me awake at night. I questioned myself constantly. Was I overreacting? Was I being intrusive? Or was this instinct telling me something crucial? Each notification that appeared and disappeared, each quick glance over his shoulder, made the questions harder to ignore. The familiar warmth of our home felt suddenly heavier, as though the air itself was thick with unspoken truths. I began to notice the changes in his routines around the house. He kept his phone close during meals, often leaving it on the counter while he washed dishes so he could reach for it quickly. He hid it under pillows when I walked by and would subtly shift positions if it buzzed. The care with which he protected it was meticulous, almost ritualistic. I found myself staring at him across the room, my mind running through all the possibilities of what he might be hiding. My thoughts started racing during quiet moments. What could he be keeping from me? Was it financial, personal, emotional? Each possibility carried its own weight, its own consequences. I remembered the earlier patterns of avoidance, the small lies, the careful silences that had peppered our life. Now, with the phone acting as both shield and key, it became the focal point for all the unspoken distance that had grown between us. By midweek, I found myself imagining what I would do if I ever had access to it. I imagined discovering messages that explained the avoidance, the excuses, the tension that had quietly filled the spaces between us. I felt a strange sense of empowerment and dread at the same time. Part of me wanted to respect his privacy, to trust him implicitly. But another part knew that my future, my dreams, depended on discovering the truth, no matter the risk. Finally, after days of tension, I resolved silently that if an opportunity arose, I would check it. Not recklessly, not vindicatively, but carefully, deliberately, seeking answers that had long been buried. That night, as I lay awake in the darkness of our bedroom, I felt a strange clarity. The phone, once an object of routine, had become a symbol of the unseen cracks in our marriage. And I knew, without fully understanding what I might find, that I could no longer ignore it. It happened on a quiet Thursday night, the kind where the house seems to hold its breath. He had fallen asleep on the couch while watching a rerun of a show we had seen 100 times. The room smelled faintly of popcorn and the faint lemon from the cleaner I had used earlier. His phone buzzed softly on the coffee table, face down as usual. My pulse quickened before I even realized why. Something about the rhythm of that vibration made my stomach tighten. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the device. The instinct to respect his privacy warred with a deeper, undeniable curiosity. I felt a sudden rush of fear, the kind that twists your stomach and makes your throat tight. I told myself I would only glance, just a quick look to see if it was urgent. But the moment I unlocked the screen, the world shifted beneath me. The notification was from a name I didn't recognize. My fingers shook as I opened the message, reading words that instantly felt like shards of ice pressing against my chest. The tone was intimate, too intimate, the kind that didn't belong in a normal friendship. A casual greeting carried an undercurrent of familiarity and expectation. My mind reeled. How long had this been happening? Why hadn't I noticed? Every line of text seemed to confirm the suspicions I had been avoiding for months. The words were carefully phrased, yet the message hinted at secrets, hidden plans, and a shared understanding I had never been a part of. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, thudding so loudly I thought it might wake him. The weight of what I was reading pressed down on me like a physical force, and I realized, with an ache that felt both familiar and foreign, that something fundamental had been kept from me. I leaned back against the couch, my mind racing to connect dots that had long sat quietly in the background. The canceled trips, the avoidance of conversations about children, the mysterious phone habits, all of it snapped into focus. I saw patterns I had dismissed before, and suddenly they were undeniable. The comfort I had felt in our home, in our routines, felt like a fragile illusion. My trust, painstakingly built over years, seemed to dissolve in an instant. I couldn't move immediately. My hands shook as I scrolled through the thread, reading carefully, absorbing details I wished I didn't understand. Each word layered new tension into my chest, twisting the familiar warmth of our marriage into something foreign. The ordinary living room, the soft hum of the TV, even the gentle night breeze through the window. All of it felt suspended, transformed by the knowledge I now carried. A part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers and force him to explain. Another part, smaller but persistent, told me to wait, to observe, to understand fully before acting. I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't a fleeting mistake or a momentary lapse. The message hinted at months, maybe years of hidden truths, carefully compartmentalized to remain invisible to me. The realization made my hands clench into fists without conscious thought. I stayed there for what felt like hours, though it may have been minutes, my thoughts spinning around what I had discovered. I replayed every conversation we'd ever had about children, every gentle dodge, every subtle tension, every small avoidance. Every memory I had once considered benign now carried a new weight, a hidden meaning that pressed down on me. My disbelief transformed into clarity. This wasn't just avoidance. It was intentional, deliberate concealment. Finally, exhaustion began to pull at me, but the tension didn't ease. I moved the phone carefully back to the table, keeping my hands steady despite the thrum of adrenaline. The quiet of the night pressed against me, as if the walls themselves were aware of the secret I now held. I lay down on the couch beside him, careful not to wake him, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the life I thought I knew, and the truth I had just uncovered. By the end of that night, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing about our marriage would ever feel the same again. The message had revealed a hidden layer of his life I wasn't meant to see, something carefully protected, something that explained the distance, the avoidance, the subtle cracks I had felt but ignored. I closed my eyes with a quiet ache, the weight of understanding pressing into me, knowing that my world had just changed, permanently, irrevocably. The next morning, I moved through the house in a haze. The sunlight felt sharp against my skin, almost intrusive, as if the day itself knew something had shifted. I kept returning to the memory of the message I had found the night before. My chest tightened at the thought, and the house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, suddenly seemed unfamiliar. Every corner, every familiar object, now carried an unspoken tension, and my mind raced to make sense of what I had learned. I wandered into the bedroom, my eyes unconsciously scanning the room for anything out of place. That's when I noticed the small drawer in his nightstand. One he had always insisted held nothing important. I had opened it once years ago, but it had seemed empty, unremarkable. That memory now seemed strange. I remembered how careful he had always been about privacy, how quickly he would deflect any curiosity about personal belongings. A sudden thought gripped me. Maybe this drawer held pieces of the story I was only beginning to understand. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. A rush of fear and adrenaline pulsed through me. What if I was wrong? What if I was overreacting? My rational mind whispered warnings about trust and boundaries, but my heart, aching and raw, told me this was the moment I could no longer ignore. I needed to know, and if I didn't act, I feared I would spend the rest of my life haunted by questions. I gripped the drawer and slowly pulled it open. Inside, I found a small stack of envelopes, neatly arranged but clearly hidden. My stomach lurched at the sight. Each envelope was labeled with dates and names I didn't recognize. The handwriting was familiar, unmistakably his, but the content I had yet to see made the neat arrangement feel ominous. I could sense immediately that these weren't casual letters or bills. The careful storage, the secrecy. It all pointed to a life he had kept entirely from me, hidden behind layers of charm and routine. I picked up the first envelope with trembling fingers. My mind raced as I imagined what could be inside. Letters, notes, receipts, proof of something I wasn't ready to comprehend. The paper felt heavier than it should have, carrying the weight of secrecy and deliberate concealment. Even the scent, slightly musky, almost antiseptic, seemed charged with significance. I realized, with a cold clarity, that this drawer was not just a hiding place but a vault protecting truths he never intended for me to see. Carefully, I opened the envelope. Inside was a collection of folded papers, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be correspondence with someone unknown to me. Each line of text carried intimacy, familiarity, and a deliberate concealment of the life I thought we shared. As I read, my hands shook, and the house around me felt impossibly quiet, almost complicit. My vision narrowed to the words on the page, the evidence of the betrayal that had been quietly unfolding right under my nose. My thoughts began racing uncontrollably. How long had this been going on? How carefully had he managed the facade of a normal, loving marriage while hiding another life in these envelopes? I remembered every canceled trip, every evasive conversation, every subtle tension that had grown over the years. Each memory now carried the weight of confirmation, and the realization that I had been kept in the dark for so long twisted inside me like a cold knot. The more I discovered, the heavier the air felt. I leafed through the envelopes methodically, almost mechanically, my emotions swinging between disbelief, rage, and sorrow. It was impossible to ignore the deliberate nature of the concealment. Every detail, the organization, the labeling, the careful storage showed premeditation. This wasn't a fleeting secret. It was a long-standing, hidden life, and I was only now seeing the full scope of it. By the time I closed the last envelope, exhaustion and emotional weight pressed down on me. My hands were sore from holding the papers, but it wasn't physical fatigue. It was the burden of revelation. The drawer had become a symbol of everything he had hidden, a tangible manifestation of the distance I had felt but never fully understood. The quiet of the house felt deafening now, filled with the invisible presence of deceit that had grown under my own roof. I returned the envelopes to the drawer, careful not to disturb the order. Sitting back on the edge of the bed, I realized something profound. My world had irrevocably changed. Trust, once effortless, now felt fragile. Every smile, every touch, every seemingly ordinary day suddenly carried hidden weight. The drawer had shown me a truth I wasn't meant to know, and yet, in that revelation, a resolve began to grow within me. I didn't yet know how I would act, but I knew I could no longer ignore what I had discovered. After discovering the drawer, I couldn't stop seeing the patterns that had always been there, quietly woven into our daily life. Every canceled plan, every vague excuse, every moment of avoidance suddenly aligned into a map I hadn't been brave enough to read before. I noticed how he always had a reason to avoid emotional topics, how he seemed to flinch when certain people were mentioned, and how carefully he guarded his phone. It became impossible to ignore. The little things I had once dismissed as quirks now felt like deliberate signals, each one a thread connecting to a hidden life. I remembered anniversaries he had postponed, trips he had suddenly canceled, and moments when his focus had drifted in ways that had seemed innocent at the time. Looking back, the consistency of it all hit me like a hammer. He had been orchestrating his own distance for years. I began retracing our timeline in my mind, piecing together incidents that had once seemed isolated. There was the weekend he worked late during a cousin's wedding, the time he disappeared for hours during my birthday brunch, the subtle way he deflected any conversation about children or family plans. Each memory, once comforting or easily explained, now felt like part of a pattern he had carefully constructed. The realization made my stomach twist. Even the small gestures that had once felt tender now seemed calibrated. The hugs that arrived just after a long day, the smiles that followed inconvenient moments, the little notes he left around the house. They all fit into a rhythm that kept me distracted from the truth. It wasn't that he hadn't loved me in some way. It was that love had been interwoven with control, carefully managed to hide his other life. I started observing his behavior in real time, like a detective retracing his steps. I noticed how he checked his phone when I entered a room, how he held it differently in his hand depending on who might be calling or texting. I caught the way he glanced at notifications quickly, then looked away with a casual shrug. I realized these were rehearsed patterns, behaviors he had perfected to make secrecy appear natural. Every day the tension grew. I found myself anticipating his movements, noting the pauses in conversation, the slight shifts in tone, the way his eyes avoided certain details. I became hyper-aware of every interaction he had, even the most mundane. Grocery store runs, dinner with friends, phone calls, all were loaded with potential revelations. The patterns were undeniable, and the weight of knowledge pressed on me relentlessly. I also noticed how he carefully curated what I could see. He avoided receipts, redirected questions, left emails unopened when I was nearby. Even his social media behavior was deliberate. Photos cropped, interactions muted, posts vague. He had built a shield, subtle enough to seem normal, but strong enough to hide the truth from someone who trusted him completely. And now, after the drawer and the messages, I could see it all. The emotional impact was heavy. I felt betrayal layered on disbelief. How could someone I shared my life with conceal so much? How could the man I had loved for years hide entire relationships, intentions, and secrets from me? Every memory of our life together was now tinged with suspicion. I began questioning not only his actions but my own judgment, wondering how long I had been oblivious, how carefully he had manipulated reality. Despite the anger and hurt, there was a part of me that felt oddly empowered. Seeing the patterns gave me clarity I hadn't had before. I could finally anticipate his moves, understand his intentions, and prepare myself emotionally. Knowledge, painful as it was, offered a kind of control. I realized I could no longer be passive in this marriage. I had to decide how I would respond, how I would protect myself, and how I would navigate the life we shared. By the end of that week, the patterns had crystallized in my mind. They weren't coincidences. They weren't misunderstandings. They were deliberate, consistent, and carefully maintained. And as I lay awake one night, replaying every small detail in my mind, I understood something essential. I now held the key to unraveling the hidden truth, and I could no longer pretend everything was normal. The web he had spun for years had been revealed, and I had to decide what to do next. The confrontation didn't arrive in the way I had imagined. I hadn't stormed into the living room with accusations or slammed the phone down in anger. Instead, it happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the universe had aligned the moment for truth. I was folding laundry in the bedroom when he walked past, glancing toward the drawer he never meant me to open. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a pause that didn't belong in ordinary life. I held my breath, trying to gauge whether he had realized I knew. His steps slowed as he passed the doorway. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. For years, he had perfected his casual demeanor, his effortless charm, his ability to make avoidance seem natural. But now, the carefully maintained facade wavered. I noticed the slight trembling of his fingers, the way his jaw tightened just before he forced a neutral expression. He sat down at the kitchen table, pretending to read a magazine. I kept folding, deliberately slow, aware of every movement he made. I sensed him watching me, though he said nothing. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken questions. I realized then that confrontation wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was subtle. A shared tension that carried the weight of truth before words even appeared. I decided to speak carefully, deliberately, without revealing the full extent of what I knew. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but quiet. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, I saw vulnerability there, hesitation, fear, a trace of guilt. He nodded slowly, as though acknowledging an inevitability he had long denied. There was no deflection, no charm, just the raw weight of what he had concealed. I asked him about the messages, about the drawer, about the secrecy I had observed for months. He remained quiet at first, avoiding eye contact, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the table. The room felt smaller with each passing second, the air thick with the tension of revelation. Every detail I had noticed, the changed passcodes, the evasive trips, the careful avoidance, lay between us like a chasm. I could feel the years of unspoken truth pressing down. He finally spoke, his voice low and controlled. He didn't lie, at least not in words, but he offered fragments, partial admissions that made the story feel incomplete. I listened, my mind cataloging inconsistencies, noting the small gaps between what he said and what I already knew. His hesitance, his careful phrasing, only confirmed what the messages and the drawer had revealed. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a life hidden deliberately from me. My emotions fluctuated between disbelief and a cold, methodical clarity. I felt rage, yes, but also a strange sense of focus. The confrontation, though not explosive, crystallized my understanding. I realized that knowing the patterns, the messages, the concealed correspondence, gave me the upper hand. I could anticipate his next words, predict his reactions, and maintain control over how I responded. I understood the power dynamics in our marriage had shifted. He tried to explain, to contextualize, but every word he offered felt like another piece of a puzzle I had already solved. I noticed the nervous glances toward the drawer, the way his fingers tapped lightly on the table when he thought I wasn't watching. His attempts to reclaim control were subtle, almost polite, but ineffective. I remained calm, silent at key moments, letting the weight of discovery fill the space between us. By the end of the conversation, something had changed irreversibly. He wasn't defiant. He wasn't angry. He was cautious, measured, aware that the equilibrium of our life had been disrupted. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in his discomfort, but in the realization that I now held clarity. The confrontation hadn't shattered our home with yelling or tears. It had shifted the landscape of our relationship in a way that was both chilling and empowering. Sitting alone later that evening, I reflected on what had transpired. The confrontation hadn't been dramatic, but it had been decisive. I understood the depth of his concealment, the patterns that had sustained it, and the quiet power of knowing. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of control returning, a focus that I would need for the decisions ahead. The confrontation had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. The days after the confrontation felt fragile, as if every routine could crack under the weight of the truths we now shared. He moved through the house carefully, aware that I had discovered more than he had ever intended. I watched him closely, noting every gesture, every subtle hesitation. Even the way he poured his morning coffee carried a new gravity, a meticulous precision that suggested he was calculating his next steps while I observed. I began noticing small inconsistencies in his explanations, details that didn't align with the timeline he had offered. One afternoon, I found an email left open on his laptop, a message he had forgotten to close, hinting at meetings, appointments, or conversations that contradicted his stories. The shock of recognition hit me, and I realized that even after our talk, he had continued concealing aspects of his life. The lies weren't defensive anymore. They were habitual. Every casual interaction now carried a weight I hadn't felt before. When he laughed at a joke or commented on the news, I caught glimpses of tension in his eyes, subtle signals that he was constantly calculating, filtering, censoring. I remembered all the earlier signs, the canceled trips, the phone secrecy, the evasions, and it all formed a pattern that no longer left room for doubt. The foundation of our marriage had been built partially on omission. I began tracking his movements more deliberately. Grocery runs, visits to the post office, short errands. Everything was under a new lens. I didn't follow him in a dramatic way, but I paid attention to timing, to deviations from his usual routine, to moments that hinted at hidden agendas. Patterns emerged, small at first but undeniable, like ripples in water that gradually form concentric circles reaching the shore. I realized that the web he had spun was far more intricate than I had imagined. The unraveling accelerated when I stumbled upon receipts and documents he hadn't hidden as carefully as the drawer. They were tucked between folders, almost casual, yet their existence revealed details he had omitted in conversation. Trips, gifts, and payments, all pointed toward interactions and intentions I hadn't known about. Each discovery brought a pang of betrayal but also a strange clarity. The life he had carefully managed in secret was no longer invisible to me. I noticed how he began to change his behavior in response. Subtle gestures became sharper, his tone more measured, as if he sensed the shifting balance of power between us. He still attempted normalcy, he smiled, offered affection, and maintained routines, but it was calculated. Even the small kindnesses felt weighted with self-preservation rather than spontaneity. I realized that my awareness had altered the dynamics. I now controlled the pace of exposure. Late one evening, I found evidence that linked back to years of avoidance. Old emails, notes, and messages formed a timeline that explained so many of the moments I had once ignored. The canceled vacations, postponed plans, and inexplicable behaviors now fit neatly into a pattern of concealment. Each discovery layered betrayal on top of betrayal, and the emotional weight pressed on me like a physical force. I could almost see the network of secrets laid out before me. The psychological impact was intense. I felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, and empowerment. Every lie, every omission, every carefully managed secret had given me insight into his habits, his priorities, and his fears. I began to understand him in a way that wasn't flattering or comforting but clear. The unraveling didn't just expose his actions. It revealed his motivations, his calculations, and his inability to be honest with someone who loved him unconditionally. By midweek, I realized the unraveling was irreversible. He could no longer maintain the careful balance he had curated for years. Even casual remarks, glimpses of his phone, and moments of distraction betrayed more than he intended. I could anticipate his reactions, predict his silences, and interpret his gestures. The power had shifted. I was no longer passive in his web of deception. Knowledge had given me leverage I hadn't possessed before. By the end of the week, the environment of our home had transformed. The space, once comforting, now felt charged with tension and awareness. Every glance, every word, every movement was layered with meaning. The unraveling of his lies was not dramatic or violent. It was quiet, steady, and inevitable. I sat on the couch one evening, looking at him across the room, understanding fully that the life we had built together was fractured, and the truth I now held would guide every choice I made going forward. It was late one evening, the kind where the house feels suspended in quiet, that the full truth finally emerged. I had been piecing together patterns, reading messages, and observing his habits for weeks, but nothing prepared me for what I heard next. I was in the kitchen, making a cup of tea, when he spoke my name softly, a tone I had never recognized before. It carried weight, hesitation, and an unspoken urgency. He motioned me to sit at the table with him, and for the first time, there was no attempt to maintain casual normalcy. His hands rested on the wood, fingers intertwined, as if bracing himself for the gravity of what he was about to reveal. The house was still except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My heart pounded in my chest, both from anticipation and fear, as I prepared myself for the reality that had been hidden for so long. He began slowly, carefully, his voice quiet but deliberate. The words were fragmented at first, pauses punctuating every revelation. I listened with a mixture of dread and focus, knowing that everything I had suspected, every pattern I had observed, was about to converge into clarity. He explained, in a way he had never before, why he had avoided children and conversations about a family. The reasons were layered, complex, and tied to choices and circumstances I had never imagined. As he spoke, I noticed small physical cues I had seen countless times but never fully understood. The tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, the slight flinch when mentioning certain names. All of it made sense in context now. Each gesture, once confusing, now aligned with the truth he had concealed. I felt a shiver of recognition and heartbreak, realizing that the man I had trusted had been living with a secret too heavy to share until now. The truth itself was staggering. It wasn't a single lie or betrayal, but a network of omissions, decisions, and past mistakes that had shaped his life and his behavior toward me. He explained past relationships, commitments he had made to others, and choices that had prevented him from being the father I had hoped for. Every explanation added clarity but also deepened the emotional weight, layering grief, anger, and empathy into a complex storm inside me. I struggled to maintain composure. Part of me wanted to recoil, to lash out, to demand every detail, every explanation, every apology. But another part recognized the human complexity behind the decisions he had made, the fear that had kept him silent for so long. The mixture of betrayal and understanding created a tension that was almost unbearable, a knot of emotions that refused to be simplified. As he continued, I realized the truth extended beyond mere avoidance. It explained years of small evasions, last-minute cancellations, and distant behaviors. Every subtle shift I had noticed now carried meaning. The missing vacations, the hidden phone habits, the careful avoidance of certain conversations. They weren't random. They were deliberate choices to protect both his secrets and, in his mind, our life together. Tears began to blur my vision, though I kept my posture composed. The weight of the revelation pressed on me physically, not just emotionally. I felt the room closing in, the gravity of years of deception pressing against the quiet kitchen walls. I realized that this truth, once hidden, would reshape everything. My understanding of him, our marriage, and the life I had imagined. The foundation of trust had been cracked, and I now had to reconcile knowledge with emotion. By the end of the night, the truth had settled into place. It was complete, undeniable, and inescapable. I understood why he had avoided the topic of children, why certain trips were canceled, why messages were hidden, and why patterns of secrecy had dominated our life. I recognized the humanity in his choices even as I mourned the betrayal, and I felt a simmering determination to act thoughtfully, to reclaim control without losing myself in anger or revenge. Sitting quietly across from him, I reflected on the long months of observation, the discoveries, and the subtle confrontation that had brought us to this moment. The house felt heavier but more honest, as if the weight of unspoken secrets had been lifted just enough to allow clarity. I realized that the next steps would be mine to decide, guided by the truth I was never meant to hear but now carried fully, irrevocably, in my heart and mind. The morning after hearing the full truth, I thought I had prepared myself for everything. I told myself I could absorb it, manage the emotions, and maintain control. But then he spoke again, quietly, in a way I wasn't ready for. It wasn't just an explanation this time, it was a confession. A confession that went beyond avoidance or secrecy, reaching into choices he had made long before we had even met. He admitted things I had never imagined, small decisions and long-standing secrets that completely reframed the life we shared. Each word was measured, deliberate, and heavy with guilt. His tone carried the weight of someone who had lived with the knowledge of his own failings for years, carefully masking them to preserve the life we had built. I felt my chest tighten as I realized this confession would change everything. The details were meticulous, almost clinical, and yet the emotional impact was devastating. He spoke of past relationships, obligations, and mistakes that intersected with his present life in ways I had never anticipated. Every explanation shed light on patterns I had long questioned, confirming suspicions I had tried to dismiss. It was a revelation layered with regret, shame, and an almost tangible sorrow that mirrored my own. I remember sitting silently, trying to breathe steadily as each revelation landed. It wasn't a sudden, explosive betrayal like a secret affair or a dramatic lie. It was cumulative. The weight of years of careful concealment, the deliberate shaping of our shared life to exclude a future I had envisioned, and the deliberate omission of key truths had built into a structure of deceit that now collapsed in front of me. My mind replayed every memory with this new perspective. The canceled anniversaries, the trips he never wanted to take, The way he had always avoided conversations about family. They weren't minor missteps or quirks. They were deliberate, calculated actions that had shaped my expectations and trust. Each memory felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place, but the picture it formed was darker than I could have imagined. I felt anger, deep and quiet, coiling in my chest like smoke. But alongside it was grief, a slow ache that seemed to seep into my bones. I realized that the person I had loved, the marriage I had trusted, and the life I had imagined had been built on a foundation of selective truth. The confession didn't just reveal past secrets. It reframed every day, every choice, and every moment of intimacy we had shared. Despite the intensity of the betrayal, there was a strange clarity in the confession. Finally, everything made sense. The patterns, the hidden messages, the avoidance, the secrecy, they all fit into a coherent, undeniable narrative. I could finally connect all the small inconsistencies, the tiny lies, the evasive gestures, into a full understanding of the life he had been leading in parallel with the one I thought we shared. I didn't speak for a long time. I just listened, absorbing the weight of his words, feeling the tension between anger and understanding, betrayal and empathy. There was a cold, almost clinical precision in how I cataloged everything he said, storing it in my mind like evidence. Every detail mattered, every nuance of tone and phrasing, because it revealed not just what had happened, but why he had thought it necessary to hide it from me. By the time he had finished, the house was silent except for the soft ticking of the clock. I felt the room shift around me, a tangible heaviness that wasn't there before. The confession had shattered the remaining illusions I held, leaving only stark reality. I realized that moving forward would require thought, restraint, and clarity. The revelation had changed the rules entirely. Nothing could return to the way it was. Sitting alone was complete. I allowed myself a moment to emerge from it and feel the full spectrum of emotions. After the confession, shock, I spent days in careful observation, betrayal, planning, and quiet reflection. Simmering sense I realized that my response couldn't be broken open the hidden chambers anger of our alone life, would accomplish exposing nothing. The truth. The kind of justice I needed had to be measured, intelligent, I knew then that the next steps would require careful planning and control without risking my measured approach that would reclaim control. I wanted him to face the consequences of his choices without me becoming someone I might later regret. I began by establishing boundaries that had been absent for years. Small actions at first. I kept certain conversations strictly factual, avoided emotional escalation, and began managing shared spaces in ways that subtly reinforced my awareness of his secrets. I moved items in the house, adjusted routines, and created subtle friction points that reminded him I was no longer naive, that I could see the patterns he had relied upon. Next, I documented everything I had discovered. Messages, emails, receipts, and the contents of the hidden drawer were cataloged carefully. Not out of revenge alone, but so that I could make informed decisions in the future. This methodical approach gave me a sense of control I had lacked while being manipulated by secrecy. Each document, each note, became a tool, not to shame him, but to anchor my understanding and prepare for strategic decisions ahead. I began to observe him in a new way, noting how his behavior shifted under scrutiny. He was more cautious, less confident, his habitual evasions no longer working. I didn't confront him constantly. Instead, I let him operate under the knowledge that I was aware, that I had the clarity he lacked. Every small misstep, every attempt at subtle deflection, only reinforced his awareness of my quiet authority. Intelligent revenge required patience. I avoided dramatic displays or confrontations. Instead, I let natural consequences unfold. I adjusted financial controls, monitored shared commitments, and subtly ensured that his actions now had accountability. Where he had once hidden and maneuvered freely, he now had to operate transparently, constrained by the awareness that I could see and respond at any moment. I also focused on my own life, strengthening relationships with friends and family, and reclaiming emotional energy he had indirectly manipulated through secrecy. By fortifying my support system, I created a buffer against manipulation and ensured that his influence over my emotional state was minimized. I was no longer living under his carefully curated invisibility cloak. I was visible to myself, and that visibility was powerful. The subtlety of this approach was key. I didn't seek revenge through confrontation or humiliation. I didn't need to expose him publicly or yell accusations. Instead, I let the truth I had discovered guide the natural consequences. He began to experience the quiet discomfort of being fully observed, the accountability he had never faced before. Every action, every choice, became more deliberate because he could no longer rely on my ignorance. At home, our interactions shifted. Conversations became structured, roles clarified, and his attempts at charm or evasion were met with calm, measured responses. I controlled the flow of information and ensured that his privileges of secrecy were removed. The home, once a space where deception thrived unnoticed, became a space of transparency and personal empowerment. I was no longer living in the shadow of his choices. I had illuminated them. By midweek, the quiet justice had taken hold. I could see subtle changes in his behavior, small acknowledgments that he understood the shift. He wasn't punished in the traditional sense. He was made to face the natural repercussions of years of concealment. He had to operate under scrutiny, under awareness, under the weight of a truth he could no longer manipulate. Sitting alone at night, I reflected on the process. It was effective not because it was dramatic or forceful, but because it was deliberate, thoughtful, and aligned with my own values. I had reclaimed power, dignity, and agency, without compromising the integrity I still cherished. The quiet revenge and justice were complete. He now operated in a world where secrecy no longer protected him, and I had proven to myself that I could respond to betrayal with intelligence rather than rash emotion. By the end of this period, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in years. The knowledge I had uncovered, the boundaries I had established, and the strategic steps I had taken created a sense of equilibrium. The betrayal still stung, but it no longer controlled me. I was no longer a passive participant in a hidden narrative. I had reshaped it, and in doing so, reclaimed the life I deserved. In the weeks and months after uncovering the truth, I began to reconstruct my understanding of trust, love, and the life I wanted to live. The initial shock and betrayal had given way to a quiet clarity. I realized that while his secrets had shaped the past, they did not have to dictate the future. I had the power to decide how to move forward, how to protect myself, and how to reclaim the narrative of my life. I spent time reflecting on what had been lost, what had been hidden, and what I had learned about the complexities of human behavior. The marriage I had entered with innocence and hope had been layered with deliberate concealment, yet it had also shown me the resilience of my own intuition. I recognized now that trust is not blind. It is earned, maintained, and continuously tested. The betrayal had been painful, but it had also sharpened my understanding of what I truly needed from a partner. Rebuilding my life required boundaries, both emotional and practical. I consciously created spaces where transparency was non-negotiable, where honesty was expected, and where my own needs were acknowledged without compromise. I no longer ignored small inconsistencies or brushed aside intuition. Instead, I embraced them as tools to maintain clarity and protect my well-being. In this way, the betrayal became a lesson rather than a chain. I also worked on forgiveness, not for him but for myself. I allowed myself to release the burden of guilt for having missed signs, for having trusted, and for having hoped. Recognizing that my empathy and trust were strengths, not weaknesses, gave me a renewed sense of confidence. I understood that being betrayed did not diminish my value, nor did it define the life I could create moving forward. At home, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The patterns of secrecy had been broken, and the quiet authority I had established reshaped interactions. He understood, without words, that I was no longer a passive participant. Every choice he made was now filtered through a lens of accountability. The home, once charged with subtle tension and hidden truths, became a place of deliberate clarity. I could feel the weight lift slightly, replaced with cautious stability. Emotionally, I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief because the truth was finally out and the ambiguity that had haunted me was gone. Sorrow because the years of hidden deception had altered my experience of love, family, and partnership. Yet even in sorrow there was understanding. The revelation, painful as it was, had exposed the deeper mechanics of our relationship, allowing me to navigate it consciously rather than blindly. I began documenting my reflections privately, writing about the lessons learned and the emotional journey I had endured. Each entry helped me process the complex mixture of grief, anger, understanding, and resolve. I recorded how patterns of secrecy can subtly manipulate reality, how small omissions accumulate into deep betrayals, and how awareness can transform power dynamics. Writing became a tool for clarity, a way to reclaim my narrative. Through this process, I also discovered the strength of resilience. I could acknowledge the full weight of the betrayal without letting it destroy me. I could hold the knowledge of what had been hidden, understand its implications, and simultaneously move toward a life guided by integrity, honesty, and self-respect. The betrayal had tested me, but it had also revealed my capacity for patience, intelligence, and emotional control. By the time several months had passed, I felt a sense of completion. The revelations, confrontations, and quiet strategies of justice had done their work. I no longer felt the raw sting of discovery, nor the helplessness of being kept in the dark. I had regained agency, clarity, and control over my own life. The lessons of trust, boundaries, and vigilance were firmly internalized, guiding my choices with wisdom rather than fear. In the end, I realized that betrayal does not have to define a life. It can expose weaknesses, but it can also illuminate strengths. I had learned that intelligence, patience, and self-awareness are powerful tools when faced with deception. I had discovered that justice can be quiet, measured, and effective without sacrificing integrity. And most importantly, I had learned that my future, built on awareness and self-respect, was mine to shape, free from the shadows of hidden lives. Sitting quietly one evening, I reflected on the journey from ignorance to awareness, from confusion to clarity, from betrayal to measured empowerment. The weight of the past remained, but it no longer controlled me. I had faced the truths I was never meant to know, and I had emerged whole, stronger, and fully in command of my own life. Trust, I realized, is both fragile and resilient. It can be broken, rebuilt, and ultimately strengthened through awareness, boundaries, and self-respect.